Welcome back to the Midnight Miraj School of Higher Learning. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. In this evening's tape, what we will do is we will do some reverse engineering of mainland North American history, and we will answer some questions as it pertains to what were some of the conflicts that happened in mainland North America that led to whatever civilization or whatever society that was here being destabilized. What were some of these conflicts? Who were the parties involved? This is something that we will evaluate and analyze. Also, what we will do is we will learn about an American leader today. Often when we look at, documentaries on the History Channel or even during so-called Black History Month, when people talk about certain leaders, they'll give you these African princes and African warriors, these Egyptian pharaohs. But it's very rare that you hear about original American war heroes or American emperors or American kings. So I want to take some time in this tape to talk about one, and that would be Chief Tuscaloosa, who was from the Muskogee tribe in the southeastern woodlands from the area or lands today that we know of as Alabama. So we'll look into how the conflicts between the Blackamoors of Spain, the Iberians, the Christian Crusaders that were Catholic in the late 1400s, early 1500s, how these conflicts between the Blackamoor, Spanish, Iberian, Christian Crusader Catholics and the Mayan Alabama Empire in the South was a very, very key conflict. And Hollywood can make movies and talk about these certain people, but it will give away a lot of information. And something else that I've been seeing a lot too lately is, certain so-called celebrities and people that are quote unquote popular referencing and talking about certain historical truths that may be damaging to the social lies that have been put out to keep people asleep and keep the goyim chewing on grass and just paying taxes. So I just found it to be imperative to make this tape, to do an American history review, put history in its proper context, and just help the people out there understand how do we get in the situation that we are today. And before we move forward, one of the primary issues I see that so-called Black Americans are having is when you're not really understanding exactly who our people are and looking at the history of the labels and names that our people may have not even been calling themselves, but the quote unquote scholars or whoever was doing the writing and the literature in the 17, 18, 1900s that most of us have access to when we want to study this subject. Even when we look into the United States Congress, the Library of Congress, some of the documents and articles that they may have and have preserved. You got to understand that the people that are coming from these foreign ethnicities and nationalities, they have labeled our people and called our people certain terminologies that either are a derivative of something that we named ourselves or a term that we didn't call ourselves at all. So in order to understand some of the direct events and activities that highly influenced and directly influenced how so-called Black Americans got destabilized, you must understand that these mainland North American quote-unquote tribes, particularly in the Southeast, these are the terms where when you understand the history from looking into these names and defining these names, you'll get it. So, for example, like we're going to talk about the Mobilian or the Alabama or the Muskogee or the Creek. All right. These are certain terms, the Mississippian. These are terms that we need to get familiar with and look into because that's actually where the history lies. All right. The primary source I'm going to use to read from in this tape will be my own book that I wrote, America, Moorish Paradise of the Plumed Serpent. And I'll read from page 134 to page 140. All right. So that's where I'm going to do my reading, America, Moorish Paradise of the Plumed Serpent, my own book. And what you'll find is in the book, I take some time to help the reader understand and digest some of the background situation and circumstances that the Moorish European nobility and middle and lower class people were in, the religious conflicts and issues, the different political problems they were having, the battle of the nobility, various houses having conflicts with each other. So, for example, if you're familiar with the very great series done called Game of Thrones, and they even have a new one called The House of Dragon, just that conflict between these various noble homes that come, or noble houses rather, that come from these ancient bloodlines, that is actually giving you the story of medieval Europa and the conflicts that happened in medieval Europa between the various Black and Moorish houses. All right. So those, just all those issues, you're going to have to understand that in order to understand the mentality that those people had when they first arrived to to North America. And eventually they set up the 13 colonies, and the United States of America government was born out of that. But understanding the relationship between the melanated people of Europa that were coming from Europa in the 14, 15, and 1600s, and even before that were of a Shemitic Israelite stock. Understanding the relationship between these people and the indigenous copper-colored original American people will be very, very important for you to understand history, okay? So as I said, we're going to learn about Chief Tuscaloosa, who was a Muskogee, Alabama indigenous original American man, American emperor. We'll read about him. We'll learn about some of the conflicts between the Iberian Christian Crusaders, the Jesuits, the Catholics, and the Maya Alabama Empire. All right. And, we're going to just try to put the history in a proper context. All right. So what we'll do is we'll just read, and certain points that I find to be critical, we'll highlight. So let's start. Another indigenous empire the Spanish fought was the Aztecs. Now, before we move forward, let me say this too. Now, as I said, you have to understand these terminologies and words. They can throw you off and get confusing. Words like Spanish Crusader, Aztec, Christian, Muslim, Israelite, Saracen, Mississippian, Incan. These words can sound very, very confusing. And initially, it can have the one encountering these words thinking that these are talking about different groups of ethnic national people. In some instances, they are, but in most instances, they are not. So understand that the person that is being called, let's say, a Saracen, an Israelite, a Mississippian, all these three terms could be referring to the same type of person, okay, or the same person. So look at them as almost like synonyms, different ways to describe the same person. And as I said, most of these terms come from either some ancient word that we were using to describe ourselves, to describe something that was associated with us, an activity we did, a geographic location we lived, etc. Or it's a word that maybe a foreigner used and applied to us and we didn't use it at all. So, that's why I feel comfortable using the word Mississippian when it comes to, understanding the various ethnic tribes and the cultures that were along the Mississippi River, the southeastern woodlands, etc. Because that word Mississippi, that's an original American word, all right? So, although you're going to hear me use words like Spaniards, Iberians, understand that these Spanish that are coming to the Americas, these are also a copper-colored so-called Negro people. The only difference is that they practice Christianity, Roman Catholicism. Some of them are Jesuits, some of them are Freemasons, some of them are not. Some of them are malefic and evil. Some of them are righteous and actually want to work with the original American people. So this is also not a us versus them thing. We don't want to turn this into a, Americans versus foreigners. It's not that black and white, because you had original Americans here who were willing to sell out, and you had a lot of foreigners coming here that were willing to work with the original Americans and actually were fighting against their own foreign relatives that wanted to enslave and subjugate the Americas. So understand that, a person, a man, a woman of intellect and wisdom can see the nuanced detail and information and investigation. All right. So we don't want to be too quick to have a prejudgment. All right. So let's read. Another indigenous empire the Spanish fought against was the Aztecs. Since the Iron Age of Atlantis, the minds of high priests had fallen into bestiality, and reckless savagery would be the result of this degeneration. In ancient America, human sacrificial cults began to branch off of many of the Jaguar warrior groups under poor leadership. The Mongol-American wars were vicious. American assassins would rip out the hearts of the chest of enemies in ceremonial rituals. Pale Mongoloids would be surrounded by hundreds of ferociously yelling Americans and stripped naked before being diced up like minced meat. This created a bloodlust, and Moorish Aztecs began terrorizing neighboring indigenous groups, even other Americans. Under the fully bright moon of the dark night, Aztec Americans drag in helpless Crusaders snatched up in a raid on a group of Spaniards resting asleep. The colorless flesh of Christians burst open as tomahawk blades cut away at their sternum. Bodies upon bodies are thrown down the steps of American pyramids as new victims are rotated in. Back-to-back merciless Moorish Aztecs hunt down Spanish Crusaders, causing them to wonder why they came to America. So what we have right here is, for one, the reason why I'm using the word Moorish to refer to the indigenous people, because in some of my thumbnails, you will see me use the statues that are in cigar shops that are called, quote unquote, Blackamoor Indians. So those are very, very, if I had to give you the best representation, artistic representation of our people, it most certainly would be the quote unquote Blackamoor Indian sculptures that are made out of wood, various earth elements, and that are placed in these cigar shops. And a lot of them are various antique places, both online and in real stores. But it's called the quote unquote Blackamoor Indian. All right. So understand that word Moorish is really referring to ethnic phenotype of what we call so-called original people of the Negroid Shemitic stock. Okay. And as we can see that, a lot of the indigenous Americans were slaughtering up and, kidnapping Christian Crusaders as they would come here. And they would use them in their human sacrificial, ceremonies. So that's what would be happening on the pyramid steps a lot of the times. You would have, just bodies upon bodies being thrown down the steps after at the top, the high priest may have snatched out the heart, and it may have been a war party that just, destroyed a Christian camp, a Christian band, and, kidnapped a few of the people. Now they're being used in a ceremony, to Quetzalcoatl or something like that. All right. So this is real history. So let's move on. Granada al-Andalus did not look too much different from Tenochtitlan, Mexico, or Mexico. In personal accounts of Bernal Diaz and Hernando Cortez, places of worship were held and traces of, quote, Jewish influence were observed as they watched cultural behavior of indigenous Americans. The Spanish studied them, jotting down everything they could about them, like a student taking notes in class. Other disgruntled enemies of indigenous Moorish Americans, such as the Texlaca and other Mongoloid tribes left from the earlier invasions, give Cortez shelter and plan with him to attack greater Aztecs. Montezuma, the Aztec emperor, had friendly interactions with Crusader Cortez. Many Amaru nobles saw this as a weakness, strongly against fraternizing with unknown strangers. It was known the Christian Crusaders had been killing Americans since their arrival years earlier with Columbus. Alert Aztecs were on guard, but could not show it out of respect for the blind king. Tensions were rising in central Amaru with only a matter of time until doomsday. So what was going on is when these Spanish Crusaders got here, there were a lot of the pale Mongoloid, quote unquote, Siberian tribes that were, left behind from those invasions in the 12 and 1300s. They were still here, and they were living out, throughout South America, and certain parts of so-called Central America. And they had created their own tribes, had their own cultures that were basically an amalgamation of what the original American culture was and what their Siberian culture was. So there were different type of ethnic groups that the Black or Moorish Crusaders found here. And one of the ones that they used basically as goy to do a lot of their dirty work were these disgruntled, quote unquote, native tribes that were of Siberian Mongoloid descent that actually were the servant class of these Maya, the original Guatemalan, the original Hondurans, the original Aztecs, the original so-called Mexicans. They were the servant class of these people, the copper-colored original people. So, when these European Christians came here, it may have only been, let's say, a couple of dozen of them, but it would be a couple of thousand of some of these Siberian tribes that may have, took upon the dirty work, as I say, and go in and invade some Maya, village and help, loot and fight against the people. So understand that it wasn't like they just came here and, they make you think that the white man just came and he had his gun blazing and he was like, cops and robbers, and like how they show you the Great Western and, and he was doing his quick draw McGraw, and like, no, it wasn't like that at all. It wasn't like that at all. As I said, the people that were coming here that actually were in control and that were, in contact and had direct communication with the Spanish king and queen of that time, which actually were still amalgamated and some of them fully melanated Iberian people who just so happened to be Christian. I'm talking about Isabella and Fernandez at that time. Some of the other Iberian Israelites that were working with them, financing these trips, some of the Muslims that were working with them. These were melanated people. Now, when they came here, but they did have, Caucasoid, what they'll call, what's the term? Visigothic descent, Neanderthal descent, Germans who were, Christian servants of theirs. All right. So they were along on the voyage, but they weren't calling any shots. It were the Moorish, Spaniards, the ones that were really calling the shots. Let's continue. In 1511, all hell breaks loose when Crusaders kidnapped Montezuma. The Aztecs revolted and began committing mass murder of Spanish Crusaders. Heart-ripping rituals were on a timely schedule, with plenty of beating organs ready to be stabbed up. The dark lunar goddess Kali receives warm blood from her Amaru thuggy sons this dreadful night. Only a few Crusaders survive, that is with the help of their pale Mongoloid tribal friends. After months of recovering, Cortez returns with thousands and thousands of Native Americans, enemies of Moorish Aztecs. By 1521, the siege of Tenochtitlan knocks over the Aztec Empire, where Amarucans are enslaved and exterminated. Moorish Aztec survivors evacuate the area and travel to other safe spots in North America. Let me repeat that. Moorish Aztec survivors evacuate the area and travel to other safe spots in North America. Amalgamated Spain set up a new colony from the stolen lands of the Aztecs. Roman Catholic culture brain zaps the entire region, and many original inhabitants began to call themselves Hispanic and Latin. Now, before I move forward, I want to also say this. Now, remember, this isn't just a black and white thing on, all foreigners are evil. When you look at the Peruvian line of nobility, you do see that one of the last emperors is the Moorish king of Spain. So the question is this, were some of these unions, of course, marriages between the Moorish noble houses of Europa and the original ancient bloodlines of the Americas, and they were, both parties were agreeing, to either have a son or a daughter married into the other one's bloodline, and this is going to merge the two. So you have that angle, or you think that maybe all the Europeans came here, just invaded themselves and forced themselves onto the throne. Now, of course, it's going to be a mixture of two. But as I said, we want to use our intellect and just not be too quick to go with maybe what the emotional decision may be. Let's move forward. So now it goes on to say, the amalgamated Spanish monarchy declared war on the Maya Americans of the Yucatan around the early 1520s. This once powerful nation was already on the decline when Spanish Crusaders arrived to colonize Jerusalem. Once again, I'm calling the Americas Jerusalem right here. Spanish conquistador Francisco de Montejo confronted the Maya but was overwhelmed in the initial battles, forcing the Crusaders to retreat. It was years before the Maya front weakened, keeping up a war from the coast of the Yucatan to Guatemala. Spanish Christian cities were established in the 1540s, but Maya in Guatemala lasted until the early 1700s. Moorish Americans of Central and South America were watered down by mass amalgamation with foreign Spanish. However, there were pockets of people who never gave up their nationality, taking Crusaders to the jungles for guerrilla warfare. So as I told you all before, that's why when you go to the Central American and the South American countries right now, whether it's Guatemala, Ecuador, El Salvador, etc., you're going to still see, melanated people there of all shades and original earth tones. All right. Salute to the brother out there in Ecuador. He know who he is. He said he translate this information for his wife. More than likely they speak the Latin languages. So salute to them out there. But nevertheless, we still have people down there in Central and South America. All right. And when you go down there, you're going to still see the original people there that are of copper color and various dark earth tones. All right, let's move forward. It says the amalgamated Spanish Empire continues into the Gulf of Mexico until they reach La Florida, or flowery in bloom. The south/southeastern lands of North America are filled with colorful flowers and a chameleon landscape that changes with the seasonal climate. Rich cities such as El Dorado and the mythical Fountain of Youth bring tired Spanish crusaders in hopes of striking it big. The relationship between the Americans and Spanish crusaders was toxic, making it impossible for the two to coexist. Aggressive Christian mercenaries would read statements such as the following to Moors, quote, now I'm about to read to you what the Spanish crusaders would read as a decree to the indigenous Americans as they would encounter them. Quote, I certify to you, with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and to their highness. We shall take you and your wives and your children and make slaves of them, and as much sell and dispose of them as their highness may command. And we shall take your goods and shall do you all the mischief and damage that we can, as to vassals who do not obey and refuse to receive their lord and resist and contradict him, end quote. So as you can see right here that some of these blackamoors were brutish and they were under that Christian Roman Catholic mind control and under allegiance of Hernando de Soto was one of their agents, but Fernanda and Isabella of Southern Europe. So understand that even these so-called black Europeans, they still viewed the original Americans as infidels, as beasts, savages, people who don't have a God, etc. All right. So this is that Christian mindset now trying to trample and intrude its way upon the American mindset. This was a rhetoric created from the doctrine of discovery / papal bull Dum Diversus of 1452. Almarucans were Saracens and unbelievers in the mind of Spanish crusaders, making them less than human and worthy of the worst punishments. Now, before we move forward, I want to say that when they use that term, a Saracen, they're talking about descendants of Sarah. Sarah was one of the wives of Abraham, okay? Now, he had Sarah and Hagar. These were his two wives. His offspring with Hagar are known as Hagarenes. His offspring with Sarah are known as Saracens. And the offspring of Sarah ended up being Isaac, Jacob / Israel, and their 12 sons. His 12 sons, rather, excuse me. So Israelites are Saracens and Ishmaelites are Hagarenes, but they're both under the house of Abraham. So that term Saracen is help you understand the matrilineal Shemitic link that indigenous Americans and the Europeans, the Moorish Europeans, have to the ancient Israelites or the ancient Shemites, I'll say. All right. Where am I at? All right, now let's move here. In the summer of 1539, Hernando de Soto, an amalgamated Spanish Moor, along with vessels carrying animals and people, set sail to Florida from Cuba. He found other Moorish Spaniards who had adopted indigenous Amaru culture but were on expeditions spying for gold and treasures of El Dorado. The Maya of Central America had settled in the southeast, going back thousands and thousands of years. The Timucua Maya Empire was predominantly in Florida, Georgia, and Alabama upon De Soto's arrival. Lack of drinking water and traveling rushing river currents were some of the Crusaders' challenges as they moved around. What has to be remembered is most of the Spanish were either amalgamated or full-blooded Moors. They were accompanied by pale Visigoths, but there is no way American kings would talk to them. Many of the European Moors were extremely disloyal and took advantage of sharing phenotypes with Americans. So as I'm reading right here, I'm already showing you that, many of these indigenous Americans that were in North America had ancestry that went back to Central America. And there were various ways when they went into the Gulf and came into what we call today Georgia, Florida, Alabama, the Carolinas. But I just want you to understand that the tribes of, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, they have ancestry that goes back to the Maya, Guatemalan, Honduran of Central America, that ancient empire. All right, and there's a link. So, when Hernando de Soto came in 1539, these are the people he encountered in modern day what we call Florida and Alabama. So these were so-called Black Americans that were the Mobilian, the Timucua. Also, one of the American kings of the Timucua was Saturia. Okay, Saturia, who was actually an indigenous man that ruled, and he had some issues with. Who did he have issues with? Because basically what you had at this time period were you had American tribes linking up with the French, and you had American tribes linking up with the Spanish, and American tribes linking up with the English. So they brought those beefs that they had in Europe, those beefs between England and Spain, those beefs between England and France, those beefs between, Germany and France, etc. They brought those beefs over to the Americas. So when the original American tribes were here, based on maybe whatever Moorish European family they had a business relationship with, or they had some type of marriage with, that would determine who they would, quote unquote, click up with or associate themselves with. But as I said, remember these American kings, they weren't going to talk to no pale people coming from no Europe, So they were talking to these amalgamated and full-blooded Spaniards and Europeans when they got here. The Timucua kings treated Spanish Moors with kindness, feeding them fresh fish and inviting them as guests of honor to banquets. Indigenous Americans let it be known they were not interested in Roman Catholicism or the wishes of Spain's monarchy. In North Florida, Spanish Crusaders and American Hebrews get in major battles of pure bloodshed. Spanish families are massacred and crops are burned down by Amaru assassins. Americans send hostages from rival tribes as double agents to Spanish. This often led to Spanish Crusaders getting ambushed and tricked into traps set by American chiefs. In the early 1540s, remorseless Crusaders pillage and kill inhabitants of modern southern Georgia and Alabama. So what I'm going into is how, they try to convert a lot of our people in Georgia and Alabama to Roman Catholicism, but we weren't going for that. And we actually were so cutthroat and so brutal to them and so, slimy that the Catholic, influence in Georgia and Alabama, it's a very, 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 very small remnant of it. But for the most part, it was fully kicked out. Okay. The Muskogee Tuscaloosa province of Alabama was led by Moorish chief Tuscaloosa against De Soto in the fall of 1540. During a banquet festival, Chief Tuscaloosa and De Soto played psychological warfare with each other. Chief Tuscaloosa remained in a position of authority, refusing every request of the Spaniards. De Soto had been using a custom of kidnapping local chiefs so he wouldn't be attacked by the Americans in the area. This same tactic was used on Tuscaloosa when he is tricked and kidnapped by Crusaders. Chief Tuscaloosa told De Soto and Christians he'd give them women and resources if he could get back to his town named Mobila. Mobila was a fortified military town created by Tuscaloosa to genocide the Spanish Crusaders. This Trojan horse village held Muskogee warriors who were waiting to ambush, and after a small scuffle inside the city walls, Mobilian Americans rushed out to assault Christians. From 1542 onwards, The Spanish Crusaders obliterate Mississippian, Moundville, Cahokia, Hebrew cultures of the southeast North America. New tribes and confederacies are born out of the descendants of Tuscaloosa and Timucua nations. So we just went through American Emperor Tuscaloosa, who led the Mobilian Alabama Americans against Hernando de Soto and the Spanish Crusaders in the early 1540s, 1539, 1540s. And basically this is where, Moundville and a lot of the American Maya Alabama Empire, a lot of that was starting to be destroyed from that Spanish invasion under those Catholics and Jesuits, and, the Freemasons with De Soto. Okay. And from that point, Chief Tuscaloosa, the Timucua, a lot of their descendants, went into various parts of the Carolinas and Florida, Alabama, and Georgia. And they would later on become the people that we know of as like the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, etc. All right, the Appalachia, etc. Okay. So hopefully you all learned something from this tape. It's your boy Blackbeard. Hit me up in the comment section. I'm out.